Shabbat Shalom. I hope you are all having a blessed Sabbath wherever you may be. And this week's Torah portion, we see that Israel is still at Mount Sinai, but here we have an event that is traumatic in the relationship. We see ultimately a breaking of the covenant, literally seen in Moses throwing down those 10 words that he received. And we know that Israel built a golden calf. And so we often talk about the golden calves of our lives. And I want to talk with regards to us and our calendar and us feasting unto our God. Because what's interesting with the golden calf is that Israel said, or Aaron said to Israel, "This is your Elohim that brought you out of Egypt." And so he was relating the golden calf as an image of that God. And so we often just see this as blatant idolatry, but it's more misguided and a twisting of what was right, or trying to reinterpret things rather than waiting and doing things according to the pattern. And so it really is a parable for all of us that, there's certain pressures that we shouldn't bring as a people on a priesthood, make us gods that we want. And we know we get that warning from Paul where he speaks of in the end days, people will want teachers who tickle their itching ears, tell us, give us what we want. We also see that you can't just say, look at our heart, the heart is good. Because they had a heart to feast, they had a heart to honor the God that brought them out of Egypt, but brings us also to an important part that we learn in Sinai, and that is, do it according to the pattern. And this is where Israel messed up. And so in a similar way, I think with regards to the calendar, we often want certain ideals, and so we want the calendar to say something to appease our tradition, our culture, whatever that may be. But we really don't have the right to do that. And when we do that, we will begin to make golden calves. Now, what we've seen is that since the beginning of the book of Shemot, that we have had, God has really tried to express to Moses the calendar, his heart for the calendar. And I believe this is what was given from the beginning, from the days of Noah right through, that it would have been understood. But he's reestablishing it. We see this in chapters 23 and chapters 34, where we see that he links the religious calendar must be linked to what we call a tropical year or solar year, the idea of seasons, of spring, summer, autumn, winter, that he brings in 3 times a year, and he's mentioning these harvests that are obviously related to the yearly shift of the sun. And so there's the feast of harvest, there's a feast of ingathering, and so we get his mind. And this is a really important one, because a really big struggle in the religion of Islam, which is proclaiming to be an Abrahamic religion, is that their holidays, their most holy days, do not reflect the yearly harvest. There's a respect to the sun with regards to days and the month with moons, but they don't respect the yearly cycle. And so with them, their holy days shift 11 days earlier every single year. And this really is we just can't see this in the Torah or how Messiah kept the festivals. We see that it was linked to the harvests, no matter how hard that is. And we might get into some of that of what was hard about keeping it in harvest time. But no, we certainly see, as we look through the scriptures, the first month is definitely connected to the month of spring. You go to Jericho, where we know that they entered the land on the first month. They destroyed Jericho, and archaeologically they've actually found pots of barley, of harvests, and we know, so that was springtime. They hadn't eaten all of this. This was the time they were gathering in. And then in Joshua chapter 3, it also speaks about, when they entered in that first month, leading up to Passover, that the harvest was developed. And so this is important to understand. No, biblically, we can see it is rooted and grounded in the harvest seasons. And now when you look at the different cultures of the world, we actually see that they all have a sense of the year and regulating the year. We can look across multiple cultures and we see that their New Year's, there may be a variety there, but it'll always be regulated to a specific season. Now what's interesting is we actually see that usually it is around March time. And so maybe, it's something to talk about, that we have this interesting thing in the West of the New Year in January. And what was going on in the minds of the Romans? And what we see is the Roman way of viewing beginnings in a way, as it shifted from the more ancient view, and I'll get into that in a bit. But basically, from the winter solstice, you could look and you could see, hold on, from this moment of, I think it's 21st of December, hold on, days are getting longer. And so the month after the shortest day, we're going to start beginning our year again. If I was going to be Aaron and try and give a golden calf, I'd be saying, the winter's defeated, we have new hope, we have longer days, we can see the newness and all of that. And that seems to be what has happened here. The problem is that seems to be different to how the God of Israel wants us to understand signs and to measure time. And there's nothing wrong with seeing the winter solstice. I believe the ancient peoples were well aware, and they could say, okay, guys, from here it's going to be getting warmer. But the problem is, if you call the new year, you know what it's like in the northern hemisphere. It's like you're talking newness, but then there can be snow for another 2 months or so. Thick snow. It could even not be the worst of that kind of weather, and yet you're talking about newness and new life, even though, yes, days are getting longer. There's a rule that seems to come into play when studying the scriptures and getting to know the way of the Creator. And I defined this rule in this way, that the known return doesn't determine the season, but the evidential substance or the witnessed consequence or the observational signs of that return were where the starting point would be. And so we see this in kind of related cultures in the Near East. I'm thinking of in Assyria, they would have the Akitu festival. That was interesting. Akitu means barley. This seems to be a common theme we find even in the scriptures with the Aviv, that it was harvest. There'd be, I think the way they did it was the new moon after the vernal equinox. Anyway, but there you had the sign of, life is here at this moment. We can see it. It's in full go. And that was the determining of the new year with many of the cultures at that time. And so even when we look at the Roman world, about 700 BC, before they started making January the new year, it actually used to be in March. And you may see that with the numbering of the months, where you see some months, those months, September, October, November, December, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then people say, well, how come it's 9, 10, 11, 12 now? And the reason is because the Romans, if you go back, they would say they began originally in March. So around that, the springtime. So we can begin to see our Father's ways when we look at the different calendars. We can get a sense of the original and how with time it has moved on. Another way in which the Romans have shifted things, and we know this as well, and perhaps now that I explain my law there of our fathers looking for the sign, you may see the issue with it, is that with the idea of a day or a calendar day, and it actually makes a lot of sense the way they define it. At midnight, you say, well, that's where the day begins. Well, and in a sense, we know the sun from that point is rising, in a sense. it is returning. You can make the case in terms of that. However, what do we know? What we see is in terms of the different meanings of day, at least when it's day and night, in that sense of day, we have the sense of no, we understand morning is, we use these phrases like 1 in the morning and whatever, that you can't really find that in the scriptures. Rather, boker and the earliest ideas of morning is when you see the return of the sun's rays or the actual sunrise, depending how defined you want to understand it. But there's that evidential sign of the return. Now, what the Roman calendar really tried to get away from, and it's one of the hardest parts, and for many of us, it's a tough element in the calendar to get away with, is that of the month. And so we know that they abandoned a biblical month. All right, we still call it the month, but what they did was they separated the actual moon cycle from the month. But even when you get into European languages, you can see that originally it was based on the moon. And this seems to be biblical as well. We can see that the moon in scripture is called Yarech, and a month or lunation, a cycle of the moon, was called Yerach. With Moses' mother, she hid him for those 3 months. That word used there is Yerach, about those for 3 lunations. And then also the captive woman, I think it's somewhere in Deuteronomy, there as well, you were to keep it for a full month. That as well is that word there for month is Yerach, talk about a lunation. Now, what we see in the Psalms is that, I think it's Psalm 104, it speaks about that the moon was made for Moedim. And Moedim can mean seasons, it can mean many things. But I really do believe that it's more than just tides, and it had to do with this 30-day count. Now, I'm going to do a really in-depth teaching on this at some stage, but just to understand that it's more than just that kind of seasonality. When you're reading Genesis 1:14, you definitely get a sense of he's given us these lights, and that it helps us with times. And to equate that 30-day period that we kind of understand throughout the world with the moon, it makes a lot of sense. The other thing that we see is that the word Yarach is used in conjunction with Chodesh. This is twice in the book of Kings, where you don't see it because both times it's translated as month, but what we see is that they use synonymously, that a Chodesh and a moon cycle was seen together. Now, the thing with the moon, and why I can understand the Romans, they just want to get away with it, kind of works well with this whole 365, and every 4 years you add your leap day. Because the moon it's a challenge, and there are 2 major shortcomings where it doesn't quite, it just doesn't quite link up perfectly. Now, the first one is that of the monthly cycle, because its monthly cycle is 29.53 days, roughly. And when you look at that, that's a really ugly number. Like, weeks are good, they're nice 7s. The day is 12 hours. These are nice biblical numbers. 29.5 isn't great. But what we see in the scriptures is that actually you were encouraged to think of months in the number 30, and the shortfall, you would still credit it with the 30. So there's some ancient cultures that I've looked at where it would fluctuate between technically 29-day months and 30-day months, but they didn't refer to that way. They would refer to all of them with 30 days. The moon would have that nice number of 30, but you would describe it as a hollow or a full month, depending on whether the 30 would share its first day with day 1 or whether it would be on its own. Now, the other issue with its shortfall is that of the year, where 12, because we want 12, that's another good number to have, 12 months in a year. And it would have, and for 2 cycles, you'd roughly have 12 months, but every 3rd cycle, you would need an extra one for it to catch up. And what's interesting here again is it seems as though that what they would do is they would just say, well, we're repeating month 12, and you kind of let the moon catch up in its season. And so you get this idea of an Adar Bet, a 12 rerun, as it were. And this would always happen in the 12th month, that you would have this leap element. That's what's interesting with still there actually in the Roman calendar. That's why it's at the end of February. That traditionally they thought March is the first month. At the end of the 12th, that's where you put your leap day. Now, the scriptures, it's the moon, and so everything in its season, and this seems to be the way that the ancients would do it. And now us in the West, what we've made of the month, I don't think it really gives much honor to the Creator. I've never looked at the before, 20 years ago, the moon was something I saw every now and then. Looked beautiful, I would appreciate it in a moment, but I had no idea even how it worked, where it was going, where it's shining, how it's reflecting the sun's light. It really was far from that. Now, I really believe the calendar is a parable for life, and we all have our sphere of influence with our own kind of gravitational pull. And my children, they have a pretty close orbit around my wife. But once a day I come into their orbit, and I think there's something good about our place and to what degree we influence each other. And there's time to be dominant, there's time to be submissive. There's a time to hold back for others so that they may come forward, and there is a time to move forward and also to leave others behind. There's a dominance that we should want priesthoods to have over kings, and there are times when you want kings to have authority over all the people. But there are also spheres and allotments that people should have, that no king or priest should ever enter and violate, as with David and him taking Uriah's wife, no matter how great he was in the kingdom. And the same with those who Messiah says, the least of these, those who would wish to malign them, you put a ball and chain around them and you throw them into the depths of the sea. There's always an element to be respected and to allow their light to shine. And so it's really something to see how, much of life is we mess up understanding where we begin and where we end. So we often mess up when we're meant to talk or be silent, or we're silent when we're meant to talk. I think of Solomon, who said, everything has its season under the sun. And, wisdom will be if the Father can just help us to know where we belong. And so for godly women, I would imagine that you have no issue with hearing Paul describe women as the weaker vessel, and that part of a woman's life is to reflect a dominant vessel. When Joseph saw the dream of the sun, moon, and the stars, we all intuitively know who represents the moon, that at this stage it was Leah. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's good that we intuitively should know these things. And it's destructive when we do not understand how our God has placed us, and when we reject that order. And so it's similar with the calendar. I really believe we can make golden calves, that we can produce a completely solar calendar if you want. You do not have to use the moon. That's kind of what you have in the West. It's really easy to work, but it can't be, you can't describe it as a Yereach. You can't describe it as having anything to do with the moon, because it just doesn't right now. But we need to understand everything should have its rightful place. In a similar way, you could say, I could see them at the base of the mountain going, what? Our God is strong. We saw him part the waters like the strength of a calf. Our God is like that. And our God, his words are like gold and more precious than precious metals. And so he is like gold and that preciousness. but not allowing things in their rightful place or combining them in the wrong way. So we stumble and we would be offending our God. As we're heading through our seasons and we're excited for what might lie ahead, may we be humble as we come back, seeing that He's revealing things. We're having a little bit of light to understand. I think New Year should be in the springtime of the year. It was originally called Passover, or the Pesach, and it wasn't Easter. That some of these things that we've made our culture, that really we need to get back to the heart of Messiah, well, what was written. And to realize He hasn't changed like shifting shadows. These are really ancient things. And with enough light from heaven, I believe that He can help us understand His seasons again. Shalom.